So thank you very much, Enrique, and a very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen. I will now take you through the second part of our sessions, but before I start with my presentation, just a couple more words to introduce myself. I'm Fabrizio Pellizzetti. As Russell has already mentioned, I'm the continuous improvement Lean Six Sigma expert for ILX. Been working with the organization for a few years now, but more in general, I've been involved in the change and transformation consultancy business for nearly 20 years. Work with organizations in finance, banking, insurance, telecommunications, IT and software, but also public sector organizations and technology startups. And over the years, I've developed a true passion for change and innovation, and I'm constantly looking for new ways to help organizations embed a culture of continuous process improvement. So what I would like to share with you this morning is a model that we've developed here at ILX that uses agile principles to help us in process improvement. So the focus of my presentation is slightly different from what you heard from Enrique. He was talking more about agile in the context of project management. This is all about agile process improvement. So the agenda is a very nimble one for obvious reasons of time, but I would still like to start with giving you an introduction to the main concepts around continuous process improvement, and then I would like to show you how we can use agile principles to help us accelerate deployment of our continuous improvement initiatives. We'll then try to draw some conclusions and, as Russell said, leave some space for questions and answer at the end. So part one, very high level overview to continuous process improvement. Who in the room is involved in process improvement, change and transformation? Well, I like to think that change and transformation and improvement is everyone's business. So I assume that everybody's interested in continuous process improvement. And the first thing we need to ask is, why do we need continuous improvement? And the first thing to notice is that modern organizations have to manage increasingly complex processes. Processes that very often support operations that stretch across the entire globe, processes that interface with our customers, with our suppliers. And these processes are constantly under pressure. They're constantly challenged to deliver better, faster, and cheaper. And the main reason for this pressure, in one word, is change. Change takes many different forms. It could be changes in customer requirements and expectations, change driven by new technologies, changes in regulation, organizational change, restructuring, mergers, acquisition, and in general, the pressure coming from competition. So in short, every organization faces a number of what we call process performance challenges. Now, how do we respond to these challenges? Well, in my opinion, we only have two choices, really. Either we embrace a logic of continuous improvement and introduce a systematic approach to dealing with those challenges, or we are at the risk of being constantly firefighting. And firefighting, I don't need to tell you, is not a very good strategy. It's one that usually comes with a huge cost for the organization. Unfortunately, it's one of those costs that we're not very good at measuring, but also firefighting drives the wrong organizational culture. So continuous process improvement is the exact opposite of firefighting, and it's a much better strategy to deal with these process performance challenges. Now, when it comes to continuous improvement, there are different approaches, different philosophies to continuous improvement. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what we call best practices for project management, Prince2, PMP, best practices for service management, best practices for product development. And best practices really help an organization shape a vision, a roadmap for improvement. But at the same time, best practices tend to be very high-level descriptive models. And the underlying philosophy of a best practice is that it provides a set of recommendations, a set of solutions for organizations to go and implement. And that's why we call best practices improvement by the book. Now, if we want to be more agile in responding to these process challenges, we need to complement our best practices with more experimental approaches, like problem solving. In problem solving, the philosophy is that we don't know what is the right solution until we understand the true nature of the problem, investigate the problem to the level of the root causes, and then introduce change and improvement. So whilst in best practices, improvement is by the book, in problem-driven approaches, problem-solving, improvement is by experiment. And because of this experimental nature of problem-solving, it makes it a very good candidate to work within an agile environment. Now, what does it really mean to drive continuous improvement as a problem-solving exercise. Well, the first thing, we need to understand what is a process, and we need to understand what type of problems are we dealing with when it comes to processes. And I'm sure you will agree with me when I say that organizations today may still be structured around functions, divisions, or departments, but it is through our processes that we deliver value to our customers and our stakeholders. So the ability to model and understand processes becomes a key success factor. And the process, in very simple terms, is a system of activities designed to transform input into output. The output is usually in the form of a product or a service. The input are everything that the process requires in order to then deliver the output. So input factors will include raw materials, people, energy, equipment, forms, procedures, information, anything literally that the process consumes to then deliver an output. Now, process problems usually emerge at the level of the output, which is natural because the output is what we deliver to our users and our customers. And these people will tell us if they're not satisfied with the quality of the service we deliver, if they find defects, if the service takes too long, it comes too late, or it costs too much. These are all output measures. These are measures that capture the symptoms of the problem. And obviously, we want to make our customers happy. So we want to improve the output, but we must also recognize that we have no direct control over the output. The output is by definition an effect, it's a consequence of other factors. And these factors are what we call the inputs. So in problem solving, we will try and model our processes as a system of controllable and uncontrollable factors. We call them the Y's and the X's in the process. And this idea that we can model processes as a system of Y's and X's, the Y being the output, becomes a function of a number of input factors. This is something you can use for any process. Your core service delivery process, your HR, your finance, your IT, your project management processes. And it's very important to make this distinction between the dependent variable, the uncontrollable variable, i.e. the Y, the output. This is where we will find the symptoms of the problem. This is what we can measure, what we can monitor, but we cannot control it. And the other input factors, the X's, are the independent. This is where we will find the causes of our problems. These are the parameters we can change and control in the process. But to do this, of course, we need to understand the relationship between the X's and the Y's, between the inputs and the outputs. So problem solving takes a very pragmatic approach. It's driven again by prioritization, and it will help us, it will give us the tools and the techniques to identify what we call the critical X's. These are what we call the root causes of our problems. This is the right level to introduce change and improvement. And the journey, however, in problem solving starts with getting agreement amongst the stakeholder as to what are the symptoms of the problems that we have as an organization. So what are the whys? And these will appear in different forms depending on the organization and the process. It could be processes that generate a lot of non-value-add activities, a lot of waste, processes that generate defects, and defects ultimately would lead to poor user or customer feedback, processes that may be fit for purpose, but they deliver always too late, projects that fail to deliver value to the organizations that are systematically incapable of respecting targets and commitments, an SLA, for example, organizations that cannot use process data to drive the right decisions, and probably the worst problem of them all, a systematic failure to learn from our mistakes. So we will start by understanding the symptoms of process problems, the whys, and then of course we ask the question, how can we be effective at solving these problems? Well, the first thing to recognize is that in problem solving, as I said, we don't have the right solutions, we don't know it all. So we need to recognize that it's an exercise in learning and discovering new things. And if we want to learn something, discover something, the best approach is to ask the right questions. Problem-solving methods will really help us to make sure we ask the right questions about the process, about the customer, about the data, about the root causes. And most importantly, we also need a common language, a common framework for problem solving, if we are to do this effectively as an organization. And over the years, we have seen the emergence of a number of frameworks supporting problem solving. We mentioned earlier on the PDCA cycle, the Shewhart or Deming cycle. Those of you who are involved in Six Sigma probably have come across the DMAKE model. Some organizations look at the problem-solving cycle that comes with design thinking. So we have a number of frameworks that can help us in our problem-solving endeavors. They provide us a structure. And yet, we have challenges. There seems to be general agreement in the industry. Forget about the numbers. These numbers might change. But most of our change initiatives fail. They fail to deliver true value to the organization. And this seems to be particularly true in the world of services. So how can we increase the success rate of our improvement and change projects? Well, that takes me to part 2. That's exactly why we started looking at Agile as a set of principles and tools that can help me make my process improvement projects more effective, achieve and deliver sustainable change. That's why we combine Agile with traditional process improvement. So why do we need to inject more agility in our process improvement projects? Well, we start from this very simple consideration. A lot of our traditional improvement projects fail. We have a high failure rate of traditional improvement projects. You see projects that deliver change, but this change doesn't stick. It doesn't really drive that cultural transformation, and people roll back to the old ways of working. Because you see, a lot of improvement and transformation initiatives start with great enthusiasm, a lot of traction and momentum, all the bells and whistles, and then progressively you see the improvement teams that run out of steam before they can actually deliver benefits. That's because our improvement projects very often drag for too long. And also, we said processes change very frequently. Processes become a moving target for the improvement professionals, so we need a methodology that helps us to respond to change and do this quickly and effectively. That's exactly the methodology that Agile will provide. And Agile will help us to overcome some of these difficulties by, as we said, as we heard from Enrique, facilitating communication and mostly removing barriers between the improvement professionals and the rest of the organization. So what is in essence Agile process improvement? Well, it's a value-based and collaborative approach to continuous improvement. It's a framework that will help us to implement our change and improvement projects, but do this the Agile way, making sure we can respond to change. So it's a combination really of flexible Agile practices for project management and powerful problem-solving tools coming from this other methodology. In short, it's a way to accelerate the transformation towards a culture of continuous service improvement. That's why Agile is going to help us in process improvement. Now, of course, we know that Agile was originally developed in the context of software development processes. So I went back to the original principles coming from the manifesto and tried to map these principles to the corresponding principles that help us in process improvement. You know, in Agile, we put more value on people and interactions over processes and tools. Well, this, in the world of process improvement, translates into an approach where we favor face-to-face communication and this aspect of collaborative learning, discovery, and the essence of problem solving is really helping us to achieve this. We measure progress by delivering working software rather than comprehensive documentation. Well, the same applies to continuous improvement. We look for an approach where we can show visible changes, process improvement, and using very simple tools to help us drive continuous improvement. Customer collaboration of a contract negotiation that translates into engaging our stakeholders. No longer the experts in quality and process improvement that then try and sell this internally to the stakeholders. Everybody needs to be actively engaged and participate to change. And finally, this idea of responding to change rather than following a plan. Well, that also applies to process improvement. It translates into a requirement for a methodology where we introduce change by shorter iterations, targeted interventions, and fostering a culture of experimentation. So this is how we can map the Agile software development principles into the world of process improvement. So from the point of view of an organization, what does an Agile process improvement program look like? The first step is to make sure that we have a formal mechanism in place for what we call the problem discovery. The organization needs to be able to capture all these process challenges and sort of create a backlog of process issues. Not very dissimilar from the concept of a product backlog. So we have visibility of all the different challenges that my organization faces. Then step number 2, that's where we start prioritizing. So we try and turn this backlog of process issues into actionable, workable projects. And we assign these projects, of course, to cross-functional teams, trying to get teams that reflect the different viewpoints in the organization And these cross-functional teams will then implement and deploy agile improvement projects following this agile methodology, which is essentially workshop-based. And the goal here is to move to the experimentation or the piloting phase as quickly as possible. As Enrique said, we aim to make failure fast and cheap, so we can really foster this collaborative learning of the project teams. And once we have run our pilot projects, we can demonstrate improvement, then we will go for a formal user acceptance and think about the full-scale deployment. But this experimental aspect is really what drives the agile improvement projects. And again, back to the role of people, very important is the composition of the teams. So, as I said, we no longer want the quality expert, the black belts, to drive change and improvement. We really seek to bring together cross-functional teams with very specific roles to cover in the project. We will need to have a champion, so the sponsor for the project, but again, the champion now is part of the core team, is somebody who's actively involved within the activities of the project team. You need a process owner. In this case, I'm talking about the business process owner. That's essentially the person who's responsible for the performance of a process and ultimately the person that has the authority to change the process. I will need obviously a project manager because we're still going to run this as projects, so somebody who's in charge of the day-to-day coordination, the tracking. And then we will involve a number of additional stakeholders, subject matter experts on the process, non-core team members. These could be people from IT, HR, finance, depending on the problem at hand. And these cross-functional teams will then go through a very simplified life cycle for problem solving. It's a life cycle that goes through 4 core workshops. The first workshop is where we really try and understand our customer needs and requirements. That's what we call the voice of the customer workshop. And this is where we will try and also formalize what is the symptom, what is the why, what is it that we're trying to fix. Then you give it a gap of 1 or 2 weeks, and the same teams will reconvene to then start analyzing, decomposing, and measuring the process. This will help us to move from the level of the whys to the level of the X's. That's the voice of the process workshop. Again, a gap of 1 or 2 weeks, and then people will come back for the third workshop, which is all about root cause analysis. This is where we will try and establish a relationship between the Y's and the X's, identify the root causes, and at this point, we're ready to move into piloting and experimentation. So the third workshop is when we really start planning for our pilot projects. We start introducing change. Of course, we get the feedback, and we start kicking in this learning mechanism. In fact, throughout this cycle, you will see that the project teams will have a better knowledge and understanding of the problem, starting from the symptoms, then modeling, analyzing, measuring the process, getting to the level of the X's, identifying the root causes, and additional learning, of course, comes from the experience of running the pilot projects. So it's a very simplified life cycle that takes the team to this learning cycle that we said is really important in problem solving and in Agile. What is the net result? Well, what we're hoping to achieve and what we've seen when we use this agile process improvement approach is that we can reduce really the life cycle of our process improvement projects compared to a traditional Lean Six Sigma DMake project that usually stretches for 9 to 12 months, and that's being very optimistic in some cases. What we're trying to do is to really reduce this life cycle to a matter of weeks. 5 to 6 weeks until we can get to the piloting, the experimentation stage, use rapid prototyping techniques for the process, and then working on improving on those results. So the typical DMake project still has a bit of a life cycle feel to it. We have formal target reviews, we have reviews with the champions that are not involved in the team. With this approach, we really try to focus on value and on delivering tangible results. That's why we can achieve a much shorter life cycle on our projects. So why does problem solving work well hand in hand with Agile? It's because they share some common characteristics. Certainly this focus on value, delivering measurable value for the stakeholders. The emphasis that we put on this aspect of collective learning. I said this is also a driver for problem solving, not just for Agile. The experimental nature of both methodologies and the fact that we're very pragmatic. We're here to try and reduce defects, waste, costs. So we try and build a business case around process improvement and do it within a framework that is now more flexible, that an organization can adapt to the specific problem at hand, to the specific project. So Agile and problem solving naturally complement each other, and they work really well hand in hand. And finally, one comment. I don't know, Enrique mentioned this already, but what does it take to make it all work? What is the secret ingredient? In one word, it's people, again. We said a lot of change initiatives fail. You very often hear that people naturally resist change. Well, I disagree with that. People do not resist change. They resist being changed. We don't want people to be the passive recipients of change. People have to be in the driving seat when it comes to change. So this approach is really designed to help me develop the ability of people to contribute to change. So we want them to become change agents themselves rather than packaging change and then pushing it out to the organization. That's what we've done wrong for many years in quality and process improvement, and that's what agile process improvement will help us to change. So some key takeaways. I hope I'm doing well on time. The main point is this. With an agile process improvement approach, what we're trying to do is to accelerate the return on investment on your quality and improvement initiatives by showing tangible results, by having quick improvement to the process. It works well when we are trying to taking an iterative approach. We introduce change incrementally rather than going for a massive re-engineering of the end-to-end process. It doesn't really work like this. It needs to be about targeted intervention. Using this model, we will see that we can develop our internal skills to drive continuous improvement, and this will help us in turn to reinforce a culture of problem solving and experimentation. So this is in essence our agile process improvement framework.